When a world-famous piano mocked Keanu Reeves at a charity gala, the crowd laughed, until Keanu walked off stage in silence. What they didn't know was that he once trained in secret, and the song he would return with had never been heard before. What happened next left even his rival in tears. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The ballroom at the New York Harmony Gala was bathed in golden light. Crystal chandeliers shimmering overhead, the clink of champagne glasses barely masking the soft hum of a string quartet. It was the kind of night designed to impress. The right names, the right causes, the right cameras. Money was being raised for underprivileged youth in the arts, and the guest list read like a who's who of culture, finance, and fame. Keanu Reeves sat alone at a table in the back corner. He hadn't come to be seen. In fact, he'd arrived through the kitchen entrance, wearing a charcoal suit and no tie, his hair slightly tousled from the brisk wind outside. No fanfare, no publicist trailing him. Just a quiet nod to the event coordinator and a discreet thank you to the young usher who showed him to his seat. He sipped still water, not wine. He watched the stage, not the crowd. And when the night's headliner, world-renowned pianist Anton Belinsky, was introduced to thunderous applause, Keanu set his glass down gently, his expression unreadable. Belinsky took the stage with the grace of a man who knew he belonged there. Tall, silver-haired, every gesture he made was deliberate, refined. He adjusted the mic, smiled at the audience, and launched into what many expected would be a typical, flattering prelude to his performance. Except it wasn't. "I'm honored to be here tonight," Belinsky began, his accent sharp and precise, every syllable shaped like a dagger in velvet. "Supporting the next generation of real artists is not just a passion, it's a responsibility. In a world flooded with influencers and actors who dabble, we must protect the purity of true musicianship." A polite chuckle rippled through the room. Belinsky smiled wider. "There are, after all, too many actors trying to be artists. Let's leave music to the musicians, shall we? Not everything is a Hollywood monologue." The chuckle grew into a laugh. Some guests looked around awkwardly. Others leaned into the joke. Keanu remained still, hands folded. Then Belinsky turned, scanning the audience theatrically, before locking eyes with Keanu in the back row. "I see Mr. Reeves is here with us tonight. Perhaps he'd like to come play a piece for us. No?" He tilted his head. "Thought not." This time the laughter was louder, uncomfortable, sharp. Keanu gave the slightest of smiles. Not amused, not wounded, just still. He rose from his seat without a word. Keanu walked the length of the ballroom with the quiet grace of someone used to being stared at, yet never seeking the attention. Heads turned as he passed, some guests lowering their champagne glasses mid-sip, others whispering to their tablemates. A few clapped, unsure if he was being ironic or if this was part of some elaborate gag. But Keanu didn't look back. He exited the ballroom through the same side door he'd entered, the heavy soundproof curtain muffling the swell of Belinsky's voice behind him. Outside, the hallway was dim, carpeted in rich burgundy, lined with portraits of past donors and artists. A young valet stood nearby, startled to see him. "Mr. Reeves, do you need anything?" Keanu paused. His voice was low. "Just some air." He walked past without fanfare, pushing open the door that led to the balcony garden. Cold wind greeted him, carrying the sounds of New York traffic several stories below. The city pulsed on, uncaring and alive. He leaned on the railing, letting the silence of his own thoughts take over. Inside the gala, the program resumed as if nothing had happened. Anton Belinsky's fingers flew across the piano keys, delivering a flawless interpretation of Rachmaninoff. Applause thundered. Critics nodded. The cameras rolled. But something had shifted. Not in the room, in Keanu. As he stood alone on the balcony, He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out something he hadn't touched in years. A small, cloth-bound notebook. The edges were frayed. Inside were hand-copied scores, tiny notes in Japanese, and a clipped photograph of a man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. Yasuo Tanaka, his teacher, his mentor, the man who had taught him the language of keys when words had failed. Keanu traced the edge of the photo with his thumb, remembering. There had been a time, brief, buried in his youth, when piano was the only thing that made sense, after the loss of his best friend, after the silence that grief brings. Yasuo had taken him in not as a star or a student, but as someone learning how to breathe again. The memory of those long practice hours, of music as meditation, returned like a tide. He flipped to the last page of the notebook. There, tucked in carefully, was a folded letter in soft paper. He had never reread it, not since the funeral. But tonight, beneath the ridicule, beyond the spotlight, it was time. He unfolded the letter and began to remember who he had once been. Before the cameras, before the fame, before the world knew his name. The letter smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The ink, though faded, remained legible. Yasuo's handwriting was sharp, clean, deliberate, just like the way he'd taught Keanu to play. Someday, you will return to the notes, not to impress, but to speak what words cannot. That sentence stopped him. It wasn't about ego. It never had been. Yasuo had told him once, during a difficult lesson, that music was not a stage, it was a confession. When the world gets too loud, he had said, we don't play louder, we play true. Keanu folded the letter slowly, pressing it back between the pages. Then he held the notebook against his chest for a long, still minute. Inside the ballroom, the program had moved on to its final act. Anton Belinsky received a standing ovation. His name was already trending online. His quote about actors and artists was now circulating on celebrity blogs. Some defended Keanu. Others debated whether the joke had gone too far. But Keanu wasn't thinking about any of them. He was thinking about a piece of music Yasuo had only shown him once. A strange, flowing composition, full of space and silence. It didn't demand perfection. It demanded feeling. A piece that was never published, never performed in concert halls. It had no name, at least not then. Yasuo had whispered its name to Keanu the day before he died. The River's Silence. Back then, Keanu hadn't been ready to play it. Not even close. But now, as he stood under the cold New York sky, the memory of that melody returned like breath. He could almost feel the keys under his fingers, the rising quiet of the first note. It wasn't revenge he felt, or anger, or even embarrassment. It was invitation, the kind only memory can extend. He took one last look at the city, then turned back toward the door. He didn't re-enter the gala. Didn't speak to anyone on the way out, just nodded to the valet, who scrambled to retrieve his coat. "Should I call a car?" the valet asked. Keanu shook his head. "No need. I'll walk." As he disappeared into the night, the cameras inside kept flashing. The laughter slowly faded, and the world remained unaware that something had shifted. It's not for everyone, just for one man, but that would be enough, because something had been awakened. And the next time Keanu Reeves touched a piano key, the world wouldn't be laughing. It would be listening. 3 days after the gala, Keanu returned to his home in the Hollywood Hills. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon, leaving the sky painted in soft layers of orange and indigo. He didn't turn on any lights. The house felt too modern for the weight he was carrying, too open for what needed to be done. He descended to the basement, quiet, unfinished, rarely visited. A single hanging bulb cast pale light across the floor. In the far corner, beneath a draped painter's cloth, sat the object he hadn't touched in over 2 decades, the chest. It was wooden, scarred from age and travel, reinforced with black iron hinges that creaked when he crouched down to open them. For years, he had kept it as a sealed memory, a vault for a part of himself he thought had ended long ago. But memory never dies. It only waits. The latch popped open. Inside, atop layers of folded cloth and yellowed manuscripts, lay a small, linen-bound notebook with a leather string wrapped around it 3 times. Beneath it, a stack of photographs, and underneath those, wrapped in silk, a sealed envelope. He unwrapped the silk with reverent hands. The letter was addressed in Japanese calligraphy. "For Keanu, when you're ready." He sat on the cool concrete floor, unfolded the paper carefully, and began to read. "Someday you will return to the notes, not to impress, but to speak what words cannot. You played not with skill, but with soul. That is rarer than fame. Remember, music is not about being heard. It's about hearing what remains unsaid." The signature at the bottom, Yasuo Tanaka. Keanu stared at the words, his eyes glassy but unblinking. He ran his fingers over the strokes, remembering the days spent in a dim Kyoto studio, the scent of sandalwood in the air, Yasuo's gentle voice correcting his tempo, praising his stillness. He reached for the stack of photos, glossy prints curled at the edges. In one, he was barely 20, seated at a lacquered piano, with Yasuo standing behind him, correcting the curve of his fingers. Another showed them laughing, a rare moment of levity after Keanu had finally nailed a difficult passage. The last photo stopped him cold. It was taken the day before Yasuo passed. They stood together at a garden bridge, both in silence. Yasuo had called it a moment without melody, a place where grief and gratitude quietly touched hands. Keanu exhaled deeply and placed the photo on the floor. Then, without hesitation, he opened the notebook. The notebook's pages crackled as Keanu turned them. Some were stained by time, others smudged by graphite and ink, as if the paper itself had absorbed the years of sweat and doubt that marked every lesson. Each page was filled with hand-sketched musical notation, some familiar, some strange. Margins overflowed with small reminders. Listen before you play. Rest as much as you play. Stillness is sound. Keanu read each line like a language he hadn't spoken in years, but still remembered in his bones. Midway through the book, he found a page marked by a folded scrap of rice paper. Tucked beneath it was a half-written melody. Fragmented, hesitant, yet unmistakably Yasuo. The notes rose like slow breath, then paused abruptly, unresolved. Underneath, Yasuo had written one line in English. "For the river inside you." The melody echoed in Keanu's mind. He could almost hear it now, not from memory, but from something deeper. It wasn't performance, it wasn't theory. It was grief, translated. He gently closed the notebook, set it aside, and stood. Above him, the house was silent. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees with quiet insistence. He knew what he had to do. Walking back upstairs, he retrieved his phone from the kitchen counter. His fingers hesitated for just a moment before opening his contacts. He scrolled until he found a number he hadn't dialed since before the pandemic. One listed only as Naomi T. He typed a message. "Naomi, it's Keanu. I found the letter. I found the notebook. I think I'm ready to try." He stared at the message, then pressed send. Seconds passed, then minutes. He poured himself a glass of water and walked to the back porch. The sky had deepened to midnight blue. Somewhere across the Pacific, Kyoto was waking up. His phone buzzed in his palm. Naomi's reply was simple. "I was hoping one day you'd say that. Let's begin." No instructions, no greetings, just a door quietly opening again. Keanu smiled, not because he felt confident, but because he finally felt something else. A pull back to the part of himself he had locked away. A pull toward the keys, toward the silence between the notes. He walked inside. He had a flight to book and a piano to find. That night, Keanu didn't sleep. He paced the living room slowly, the old notebook in one hand, the weight of memories pressing on his shoulders like fog. His thoughts kept circling back to Yasuo's face, the light tapping of a baton on the piano lid, the way he would close his eyes when Keanu played, not to judge, but to feel. The letter had awakened something quiet but unrelenting, a vow he never knew he'd made. At 2:17 a.m. he sat at his digital upright keyboard, covered in dust, forgotten in the guest room. He turned it on. The keys lit faintly beneath his fingers. He placed his hands where they had not been in years. Middle C, then A minor, just to remember the shape of silence. The first notes were brittle, unsure. He played from memory at first, scales, slow arpeggios, simple exercises Yasuo had drilled into him. Then something strange began to happen. His hands moved to that unfinished melody in the notebook. It wasn't exact, but it was there, hiding between the cracks of time. He played it slowly, haltingly, with breath held between bars. By the time he reached the unfinished phrase, he paused. He remembered how Yasuo would wait in those gaps, nodding gently. "Don't fix the silence," he had once said. "Just respect it." The music stopped. Keanu let his fingers rest. His phone lit up again, another message from Naomi. "Do you remember the river's silence?" He replied, "It's the only thing I can hear right now." She answered within seconds. "Then let's start there." He sat for a moment, hands still on the keys, the hum of the digital piano lingering in the air. The world outside remained unaware. To the internet, he was still the man who had been publicly mocked by a maestro. To the headlines, he was a target, a punchline, a misunderstood silence. But to one man in the dark, with a worn notebook and a bleeding memory, he was something else entirely. He was a student again, of music, of loss, of stillness. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was coming home. Not to a house, but to a sound that had waited for him, quietly, beneath the noise of the world. The morning after his midnight practice, Keanu sat at the kitchen counter with a black coffee and his phone propped up beside him. The video call rang twice before connecting. On the screen appeared a woman in her late 30s, with almond-shaped eyes and the composed demeanor of someone raised in the orbit of silence and focus. "Good morning, Reeves-san," Naomi Tanaka said in soft, fluent English, or should I say, student again? He gave a small bow toward the camera. "Morning, Naomi. Thank you for picking up." "I've been expecting this message since I was 14, she replied, folding her hands calmly on the piano before her. Behind her, the Kyoto studio he remembered was exactly as it had always been. Polished wood floors, a row of silent music stands, the familiar upright piano her father had once used for every lesson. "I remember you," she added. "You weren't like the others." Keanu tilted his head. "Because I was terrible?" She smiled faintly. "No, because you played like someone trying to remember someone they lost." That silenced him. Naomi didn't press further. She adjusted her seat and said, "We start from posture. Sit up straight, center of balance over your feet. Let me see your hands." He raised them to the camera. She nodded. "Still intact. Let's see how long they last." Keanu laughed under his breath. The first exercise was deceptively simple. Slow scales, both hands, controlled motion. But halfway through, his right wrist cramped. His left pinky struck a wrong note. He stopped and sighed. Naomi said nothing. She waited. "Yasuo would have had a cane by now," Keanu muttered, massaging his palm. "True," Naomi said. "But he would have kept listening." They resumed. Every hour of film set combat choreography had conditioned his muscles for control, but piano demanded a different kind of surrender, one that didn't rely on grit, but on grace, on presence. After 30 minutes, his shirt clung to his back. By minute 45, his shoulders burned. "Stop," Naomi said. He leaned back, sweat lining his temple. Naomi tilted her head. "You're playing like someone trying to control what can't be controlled." Keanu took a deep breath. "I'm used to control." "I know," she said gently. "But this piece, the one you want to relearn, it isn't about control, it's about surrender." She paused. "And that's harder than muscle?" Keanu wiped his hands on a towel and leaned closer to the screen. "So how do I relearn that?" he asked, voice low, almost ashamed. Naomi didn't answer right away. She leaned down and placed a page of handwritten music on her stand. "This is your next assignment," she said. "It's the original form of the piece my father called The River's Silence. You saw only fragments in your notebook. This version is complete. He left it with me before he died." Keanu's eyes softened. "You knew he'd want me to have it." "No," Naomi said, "but I knew it when I saw the way you touched the keys last night." She clicked a few keys on her laptop and sent the sheet music digitally. A notification pinged on Keanu's screen. He opened the file. There it was, the same opening motif from his notebook. But now it unfurled with complexity, phrases that bent like reeds in wind, unresolved cadences that somehow still felt complete. "It doesn't follow Western structure," Keanu observed. "It doesn't follow anything," Naomi said. "He wrote it for those who've lost someone and don't know how to grieve with words." Keanu leaned back and stared at the page. "You said I used to play like someone trying to remember," he said. Naomi nodded. "Now I'm afraid I've forgotten completely," she replied. "Good. That means you're not pretending." They scheduled another call for the following night. In the hours before it, Keanu canceled his afternoon meetings. He set up his upright piano in the center of the living room, opened the windows, and played through the first two measures over and over. His fingers refused to obey, not because of technique, but because every note seemed to ask him to feel too much. He pushed through anyway. Each mistake was not an embarrassment. It was a marker, a reminder that he was, once again, a beginner. That night, Naomi called again. He played for her. "You're rushing," she said. "You're afraid of the pauses." He nodded. "They feel like falling." "Then fall slower," she replied. By the third night, Naomi said very little. She watched from her studio in Kyoto, arms folded, face unreadable. Keanu sat at the keyboard, posture stiff but improving, his eyes scanning the sheet music with deliberate care. He played the first page of The River's Silence again. Still not clean. Still not confident. But something had changed. He wasn't chasing the notes anymore. He was listening to them. The pauses between chords carried weight now, like footsteps across a bridge only he could see. The left hand moved slower than it should have, but it wasn't from fear. It was because the melody asked for reverence, not speed. When he lifted his hands at the final note, Naomi remained quiet. Then, softly, she spoke. "I remember hearing you practice through the wall when I was a child," she said. "You used to stop in the middle of pieces. My father never interrupted. He said, 'That boy is playing to find someone. Let him search.'" Keanu blinked, not speaking. Naomi leaned closer to her camera. "You're still searching, aren't you?" He nodded. She offered the faintest smile. "Good, because this piece will not let you arrive until you do." The call ended a few minutes later. Keanu closed the laptop and turned off the piano. But he didn't leave the room. Instead, he pulled out a notebook and began writing by hand. Phrases, feelings, things he couldn't say out loud. Not yet. Each word was anchored in a moment, a sound, a loss. The journal was filling fast these days. He realized he wasn't training to perform. He was training to feel, to remember, to honor a promise buried in silence. As the sky turned from night to pale morning light, Keanu sat back down at the keys, not to show Naomi, not to prove anything, just to be with the music, to sit beside the ghost of Yasuo once more, and listen to what still waited in the spaces between. Budapest in late October wore its dusk like a velvet curtain, heavy and deep. Each evening, after long hours on set, wrapped in the gray layers of his character's world, Keanu returned not to rest, but to practice. The production company had arranged for him to stay in a boutique hotel nestled between the Danube and the Old Market District. But it was Keanu who had quietly requested something else, an upright piano. He found one through a local theater, an older Bosendorfer, slightly out of tune, its ivory keys worn by time. It stood in the hotel's unused music parlor, a forgotten room down a narrow corridor most guests never noticed. Every night after filming, sometimes past midnight, Keanu slipped into that room. He locked the door behind him. No security, no noise. Just the piano and the hollow quiet of the old hotel. At first his hands were stiff. He fumbled through the phrasing, his right ring finger refusing to cooperate. The opening bars of The River's Silence were deceptively slow, but they demanded more than accuracy. They demanded surrender. On the third night, his fingers cracked and bled. He didn't stop. He wrapped them in bandages and played on. Between takes the next day, he watched Naomi's lesson videos on his phone, earbuds in, eyes narrowing with focus. His castmates asked what he was working on. He gave the same reply every time. Just something personal. Back in the piano room, Naomi's voice echoed from his laptop speaker, propped up beside the keys. "Relax your shoulders," she reminded him. "You're not holding the weight of the world anymore. Let the piano carry it." Some nights, he couldn't bear to look at the sheet music. He played by feel, by memory, by grief. And still, Naomi kept pushing. "You hesitate before the silence," she told him during one call. "Why?" He paused, unsure how to answer. She tilted her head, waiting. Finally, Keanu said, "Because when it's quiet, I remember things I'd rather forget." Naomi didn't flinch. "Good. So does everyone who plays this piece. That's why my father never recorded it." He looked down at his trembling fingers. "Because it's unfinished?" "No," she replied. "Because it isn't supposed to end. It's supposed to echo." That night, as he returned to the keys, something shifted. He no longer played to master the piece. He played to live inside it. Each morning, his fingers ached when he reached for his coffee. The calluses from film stunts had dulled over the years, but now new ones formed in their place, built not from impact, but from repetition. He wasn't chasing applause. He was chasing memory. One night, after a particularly long shoot involving cold rain and complicated choreography, he arrived back at the hotel just after midnight. He didn't shower, didn't eat. He walked straight down the dim hallway and into the parlor, flipped on the lamp above the piano, and sat. The melody greeted him like an old friend, one who carried both sorrow and comfort in its presence. He closed his eyes and played the first 4 bars, then paused. Naomi had said something the night before that lingered. "You're treating the notes like they're breakable," she said. "But they're not. They're waiting. You're the fragile one." He replayed that thought over and over. Then, quietly, he let go. The sound that came wasn't perfect, but it was honest. His timing softened, his tempo slowed, not with stiffness, but with grace. The music stopped feeling like something he had to play. It became something that played him. Halfway through the piece, the air shifted. A bell of stillness rang through the old room, Even the floorboards seemed to stop creaking. And as he hit the final note of the phrase, holding it just long enough to feel it vibrate through the keys, he let his hands fall into his lap and just breathed. That breath held everything: the tiredness, the healing, the memory of Yasuo's guiding hand, and the echo of every unspoken word between them. It wasn't grief anymore. It was gratitude. He turned off the light, walked back to his suite, and slept deeply for the first time in days. The next morning, he woke to a message from Naomi. She had watched the recorded session he'd sent her overnight. He read, "You found it. Don't change a thing. Just keep showing up." Keanu sat with the message for a long time. He didn't reply. He simply looked at his hands, then at the piano in the corner of his suite. Smaller, quieter, but still waiting. Another session began that evening, and another the day after. Each one slower, each one more whole. By the end of the second week, even the hotel staff had noticed. They didn't disturb him. But each night, one of the older concierges, a woman named Clara, would leave a single chamomile tea in a paper cup outside the piano room door. She never knocked, never spoke, but it was always warm when he opened the door. One night, after playing for nearly 3 hours straight, Keanu found a note tucked under the cup. The handwriting was elegant, in careful English. "Whoever taught you to play also taught you how to feel." It reaches the hallway. "Thank you." He smiled and folded it into the back of the music notebook. Another page of gratitude. That night's call with Naomi was brief. He'd played the entire first half of The River's Silence without interruption. She said nothing for a long time afterward. Then, quietly, she spoke. "You no longer sound like a man remembering someone." Keanu looked into the screen. "Then what do I sound like?" She smiled, the first real smile since they'd begun. "Like someone remembering who he is." Those words stayed with him long after the call ended. On the third week of filming, a young production assistant named Maris caught him in the hallway as he left the set. She was holding a copy of an old Japanese music journal. "I saw your name mentioned," she said, nervous, "in an article about Tanaka-sensei. You were one of the unnamed students, right?" He nodded. She held out the journal, pointing to a photo on the back page. Yasuo, young and fierce-eyed, standing beside a teenage boy at a recital. It was blurry, but it was Keanu. "I always wondered what happened to this piece," she said. "The River's Silence. It's never been recorded." Keanu paused, then offered a gentle reply. "It wasn't meant to be recorded," he said. "It was meant to be remembered." She looked confused, but she nodded, sensing the weight of something bigger than explanation. That night, Keanu sat once again at the piano in the hotel's music room. He played the full piece, for no one and for everyone. Naomi's next call opened with no music, no posture drills, and no corrections. Just a story. "Do you know why my father wrote The River's Silence?" she asked. Keanu shook his head. "It was after my mother passed away," she said. "She died in her sleep, quietly, without warning. One moment she was singing to herself in the kitchen, and the next, silence. He didn't speak for 3 days, didn't eat, didn't leave the house." Keanu leaned forward. When he finally came back to the piano, he didn't play Chopin or Debussy. He sat down and began to write, just one note at a time. The piece came over weeks. He said it wasn't music, it was mourning. Keanu glanced down at his own notes, at the wavering lines he'd penciled beside Yasuo's signature. He kept telling himself not to complain. His conscious mind was trying to negotiate in the wake of lost loved ones. He'd never done anything like this before, Naomi continued, and he never recorded it publicly. A concert pianist who quit shortly after. A woman in Norway who lost her child in a car crash. And you. Keanu's throat tightened. Hell said only those who had learned to grieve without bitterness could play it truthfully. Naomi said. That's why it sounds so simple and yet unfinishable. Keanu looked away. I'm not sure I've learned that. You're trying, she replied. And that's enough. The next hours were filled with repetition. Left-hand phrasing, dynamic weight on sustained chords. Keanu played the final measure again and again, each time softer, until the final note barely echoed through the mic on Naomi's end. She corrected him only once. You held back, she said after a particularly tender take. You were afraid to let the silence finish the sentence. Keanu nodded. Because when I stop, I still expect someone to answer. Naomi was quiet a long time. Then let the silence be the answer, she said. That night, Keanu printed the sheet music and pinned it to the hotel wall. He studied the handwritten phrasing Yasuho had scribbled in the margins years ago. Don't perform, confess. That word, confess, unlocked something in him. He no longer approached the piano like an artist preparing for a recital. He approached it like someone returning to an altar. Music wasn't a stage. It was a prayer. Days turned into weeks, and Keanu's schedule racked in Budapest. The film crew threw a quiet farewell dinner, but he skipped the celebration, retreating instead to the piano room one last time before checkout. He didn't need an audience. The only applause he sought came from the stillness after the final note. By now, the river's silence had begun to feel like a language only he and Naomi spoke. Its phrasing no longer required conscious effort. It lived in the space between breath and memory. During a lesson the next evening, Naomi watched him play the second movement. She didn't stop him. She didn't speak. When he finished, she simply said, Now, you're not playing it for him. You're playing it with him. That sentence broke something open. Keanu couldn't explain why, but tears welled up without permission. It wasn't grief anymore. It was reverence. The kind that makes you bow your head, not because you're told to, but because something sacred just passed through you. Later that week, in a brief moment between flights, Keanu opened his email to find a message from Naomi. Attached was a high-resolution scan of Yasuo's original handwritten manuscript, the only copy ever made. In her message, she wrote, My father once said, This piece will never make someone famous, but it might keep someone alive. Now, it's yours. Do with it what honors him. Keanu stared at the file. The notes looked so familiar, and yet every curve, every rest, every subtle instruction felt like a whisper from the man who had once gently guided his trembling hands into their first C major. A new kind of obsession took hold. Not the type driven by perfection, but by responsibility. He carried printed copies of the piece in his satchel, tucked behind scripts and call sheets. Between takes on his next project in France, he'd find an unused room with decent acoustics and practice in short bursts, 10 minutes here, 15 there, enough to stay close to the soul of it. He wasn't preparing for a debut. He was preserving a truth, something intimate, quiet, uncompromised. Each time he returned to the music, he imagined Yasuo sitting behind him, not correcting, not even guiding, just witnessing. And every time he reached the final chord, he lifted his fingers slowly, letting the silence speak. As Naomi had said, that silence was the answer, and Keanu was finally learning how to listen. One evening in early spring, Keanu sat at a baby grand in a quiet rehearsal space rented under an alias in Paris. Naomi's face appeared on the screen of his laptop, glowing faintly in the room's soft lighting. She was sipping tea, watching his posture more than the keys. He played through the entire piece once, the room thick with intention. The final chord resonated just long enough to leave a trace in the air. When it faded, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi leaned closer to the camera. You're ready. Keanu exhaled slowly. It still hurts. In the middle section, every time. That's why you're ready, she replied. He nodded, his gaze drifting toward the metronome she had mailed him a week earlier. It once belonged to Yasuo. The engraving at its base read, in delicately carved Japanese characters, "Time reveals everything." The brass glimmered in the low light. The metronome hadn't ticked in decades, but Keanu never wound it. He didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough. Later that week, an old friend from a music publication reached out, asking to confirm a rumor. Was Keanu Reeves preparing a performance at the World Music Peace Gala? Keanu didn't reply. Instead, he contacted Naomi. "If I did this," he asked, "would you come?" There was a pause. "I would," she said. "Not as a teacher, but as a daughter." That same evening, Keanu printed one last copy of The River's Silence. He didn't write notes or mark dynamics. He simply folded the sheet into thirds and placed it in the pocket of his coat. He sat in silence, staring out a window overlooking the Seine. The world didn't know what was coming, but he did, and it had nothing to do with proving a point. It was about honoring one, not to answer Anton Belinsky, not to correct a room full of laughter, but to fulfill a promise made long ago. To a mentor who believed the greatest music lives not in fame or perfection, but in honesty. Keanu's fingers had finally caught up to his soul, and now they were ready to speak. The rehearsal space in Paris was meant to be private, rented discreetly under the name K.R. Bell, shielded from fans, cameras, and the internet's gaze. But on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while Keanu rehearsed the opening passage of The River's Silence, a stagehand named Maxime snapped a quick video on his phone. It was innocent at first. Maxime, just 19, was captivated. He didn't even recognize Keanu at first, just saw a man in a hoodie hunched over the piano playing something that made the entire corridor go quiet. It didn't sound like classical, it didn't sound like jazz, it sounded personal. He posted the 10-second clip on a small music blog's Instagram account with the caption, "And didn't see me, just kept playing. Whoever he is, this is real." Within 2 hours, the internet figured it out. The hoodie was familiar, the profile unmistakable. Someone zoomed in, over-sharpened the grainy frame, and matched it to other known photos of Keanu Reeves. The comments lit up. Wait, is that actually Keanu Reeves playing piano? Since when does John Wick play like a morning poet? This isn't a bit, right? That's him. That's Keanu. Within 12 hours, the clip was reposted over 100,000 times. It landed on Twitter, then Reddit, then major entertainment outlets. Headlines flooded in. Keanu Reeves is secretly learning piano? Leaked clip shows Keanu practicing hauntingly beautiful piece, but what is it? Keanu playing The River's Silence. Wait, what's that? By the end of the day, the media frenzy had a new player, Anton Belinsky. He posted a tweet. Dry, dismissive, scathing. Actors at the piano? What's next, stuntmen at the symphony? Stay in your lane. The tweet exploded. Thousands of retweets, half mocking, half outraged. The classical music world split instantly. Some rallied behind Anton's purism. Others leaned toward curiosity, if not admiration. But Keanu? He said nothing. No statement, no press release, no tweet. He simply turned off notifications, silenced his phone, and returned to the piano. Naomi called the next morning. "Don't look at the comments," she said before Keanu even said hello. "I already haven't," he replied, sipping cold tea. She sighed. "Anton's poking the fire." Keanu shrugged. "He's allowed. Everyone is." Naomi hesitated. "He's not just critiquing your playing. He's dismissing your right to even try." Keanu thought about that for a long time after the call. It wasn't new. He had heard versions of it before, in quieter tones, at film festivals, at elite industry parties. The implication that actors should stay in their lane, that to be famous was to be hollow, that sincerity was theater, not truth. But he hadn't returned to music for permission. He had returned because Yasuo once told him that silence could become sound if held with care, and that was what he planned to do. Still, the fallout grew. A follow-up tweet from Anton landed hours later. "There's a reason we train for decades. Art is not a hobby, it's a discipline. Let's not confuse sentiment with skill." This time, Naomi texted him a screenshot. Underneath Anton's tweet was a response from a music student in Kyoto. "Mr. Belinsky, have you ever heard The River's Silence?" Because it was written by someone who understood both. Keanu smiled faintly. The piece had never been recorded, never released. It lived only in a few battered manuscripts and the memory of a handful of students. But now, people were beginning to ask questions. What was this piece? Why had Keanu chosen it? And why did it seem to affect people so deeply, even in 10 seconds of low-quality footage? Music critics began reaching out to Naomi. Some asked for history. Some asked for a copy. She declined them all. "It's not my story to share," she told one journalist. Meanwhile, online speculation boiled. Theories bloomed. Was it a publicity stunt? Was Keanu angling for a music role? Was the video staged? Keanu's team issued a single brief statement. "Mr. Reeves is not preparing for a performance. He's preparing to honor something personal." It only added to the intrigue. A music podcast did a full episode titled "The Actor and the Silence," exploring the mythology around Yasuo Tanaka, the unrecorded piece, and the mystery of an A-list star taking on one of the most emotionally demanding compositions ever written. But Keanu still said nothing. Not because he was hiding, but because there was nothing left to say. Only the music remained. Back at the Paris rehearsal space, the staff had begun to notice the change. Tourists lingered near the alley door, hoping to catch a glimpse. Journalists called daily, offering interviews and asking for backstage access. Maxime, the young stagehand who had posted the original clip, showed up with a guilty expression and flowers. "I didn't mean for it to, he mumbled. Keanu took the flowers. He wasn't angry. "It's all right," he said gently. "It was a beautiful moment. You just shared it." Still, the intimacy of the process was broken, and Keanu knew it. That night, Naomi called him again. She had heard from a curator at the World Music Peace Gala. They had caught wind of the story and offered Keanu an invitation. A single performance slot. No press obligations, no commercial strings. Just one piano, one piece. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat with the metronome Yasuo once used and placed it on the piano. He let it tick. Just for a minute. He thought of the mocking tweets, the applause he didn't want, the grief that brought him here. Then he called Naomi back. "I'll play," he said. Naomi's voice didn't change, but her silence said everything. 2 days later, a short press release hit the internet. Keanu Reeves will perform one piece at the World Music Peace Gala in Vienna. He will not be available for comment. The reaction was immediate. Some cheered, some mocked, some predicted disaster. Anton Belinsky remained silent, but others speculated his silence said more than words ever could. Pundits argued, critics speculated, but in the rehearsal room, Keanu simply continued practicing. He rehearsed the final passage again and again, not for the tempo, not for the memory, but for the moment where silence takes over, where music ends and truth begins. Because Keanu never set out to prove himself. He only set out to remember, and soon the whole world would be listening. The press release went live on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't blasted through headlines or shared with morning television. It appeared gently, almost like a whisper. Posted on the World Music Peace Gala's official site, and a single line from Keanu's representative. Mr. Reeves will perform one solo piano piece at the World Music Peace Gala in Vienna. No further comment. There were no trailers, no teasers, no title for the piece listed. Just a date, a name, and a time. The internet didn't need more. Within hours, hashtags exploded. Keanu plays, The River Returns, Belinsky vs. Reeves, The Silence Piece. Speculation took over. Music theorists tried to identify the mysterious river's silence. Some posted old footage from Japanese recitals, claiming fragments might have been heard in a 1977 Tokyo Conservatory event. Others said it was myth, a fabricated composition to bolster a PR moment. But those who knew Yasuo Tanaka knew better. And Naomi? She stayed silent, publicly. But that evening, she shipped a package to Keanu's hotel in Vienna. No letter, no instructions. Inside was a small velvet box. Keanu opened it gently and stared. Yasuo's old metronome, the same one from the dusty studio they had practiced in all those years ago. The same one that never ticked too fast. The same one Keanu once swore made the silence between beats feel sacred. At the bottom of the metronome, newly engraved in soft kanji, were 4 characters. She gossiped away from me. Beneath them, Naomi had translated it. Time reveals everything. Keanu didn't cry. He just placed it beside the piano and wound it once. Tick, tick, tick. Then he sat and played. The rehearsal hall in Vienna was colder than Keanu expected. It smelled of velvet and polish, the kind of room where time didn't move unless someone told it to. A Bosendorfer Imperial Grand stood at the center, its lid already lifted as if expecting him. He placed Yasuo's metronome just to the left of the keys. Tick, beats, tick. Each beat echoed faintly off the ornate walls, becoming part of the space itself. Naomi joined her video from Japan that night. She didn't ask how he felt, she already knew. Instead, she guided him through the final phrases again. "You're still pulling back too much in the left hand," she said softly. "Let the sadness breathe, but don't apologize for it." Keanu adjusted. Again. By the 3rd time through, she gave no notes, just closed her eyes. When the last chord rang out, she waited. Then, "That's it." He nodded, rubbing his wrists. They ached, but the ache had become familiar, something close to clarity. "Do you want me to come?" Naomi asked. He shook his head gently. "You already are." The following day, Keanu walked alone through Vienna's city center. No entourage, no fanfare. A simple black coat and a scarf wrapped low against the wind. He passed a music store window and paused. A display featured old sheet music, cracked at the edges, yellowed by time. One page was turned just enough for him to glimpse a handwritten annotation. Someone's old fingerings for a forgotten sonata. He stood there for almost 5 minutes, unmoving, because it reminded him, music isn't owned, it's shared, borrowed, remembered. And the river's silence wasn't about him, it was about everyone who had ever needed something deeper than words. That night, back in his room, Keanu didn't play. He sat beside the piano, notebook open, and wrote only one sentence. "I don't play to prove I belong. I play to remember where I came from." Then he folded the page and slipped it inside the piano bench. It would stay there until after the gala. As the date of the gala approached, the media turned frenzied. Tickets sold out within minutes, not just because of the world-class performers scheduled, but because of one name, one mystery. Keanu Reeves. Music blogs dissected every possible angle. They reposted the 10-second leak. They speculated on the piece. Some questioned whether he'd even show. Others were sure it was a stunt gone too far. But inside the theater, none of that mattered. Each night during final rehearsals, Keanu arrived early and left late. The staff grew used to his silent presence, the soft fall of notes echoing through empty rows. He didn't speak much. He didn't smile often. But every time he finished playing, he bowed, not to anyone, but to the silence. The silence, he felt, was part of the music. Naomi sent him one final message the night before the gala. Interrogation. Would have been proud. Not because you're playing well, but because you remembered why. Keanu read the message slowly. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out Yasuo's original sheet. It was worn, frayed, dotted with decades-old annotations. Some bars had faint smudges. Where Yasuo's pencil had changed a fingering or paused mid-thought, Keanu touched one of the marks gently. This wasn't about redemption. It wasn't even about tribute. It was about alignment, between past and present, between silence and sound. Later that night, in the stillness of his hotel room, he lit a single candle. He didn't play. He didn't rise. He just sat beside the piano and listened. Not to the metronome, not to the wind against the glass, but to something deeper, the still river beneath it all. The days leading up to the World Music Peace Gala were louder than the peace itself. Every morning, Keanu's name trended online for reasons that had nothing to do with acting. Journalists called it a curiosity. Commentators called it a gamble. Pundits called it indulgent. Some whispered admiration. Others sharpened their skepticism. One particularly vocal critic from a classical music magazine tweeted, "Keanu Reeves at the piano is like asking a poet to fly a plane. Charming, but dangerous." It was retweeted thousands of times. Underneath that, a young pianist from Berlin replied, "He's not here to fly it. He's here to remind us why we built wings in the first place." That reply quietly spread too. The division was sharp. Some artists spoke out in support, admiring the humility of a man who didn't claim to be a maestro, only a student. Others accused him of stealing a space he hadn't earned. In the center of it all stood Anton Belinsky. A week before the gala, he sat down for a televised interview in London. The host leaned in. "Anton, any thoughts on your gala co-performer?" Anton smiled with practiced ease. "Let's not confuse fame with finesse," he said smoothly. "The piano, unlike Hollywood, does not respond to charisma. It responds to truth." The host raised a brow. "And do you believe Mr. Reeves lacks that truth?" Anton's smile widened. "I believe everyone should know their instrument. His, I suspect, is the camera." That soundbite aired on every major entertainment outlet within the hour. Keanu's team sent no rebuttal. He himself remained off-grid, tucked away in the practice hall. Each morning, he arrived before the stage was lit. He placed Yasuo's metronome gently by the keys and let it tick through the empty air. Then he played the first bars of The River's Silence. Slowly, deliberately, not to rehearse, but to remember. Naomi called him one evening. She had seen the headlines, read the tweets, even heard from a few students in Japan who were confused by the sudden spotlight on their teacher's secret piece. "You're not playing for applause," she said quietly. "You're playing for peace." Keanu nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know." "Then forget the noise," she added. "Let the silence speak louder." And he did. The night before the gala, the Viennese wind curled around the concert hall like a quiet omen. The stagehands moved with caution, adjusting lights, cables, and mics, murmuring in their own languages. In the center of the room, the Bosendorfer Grand sat like a monolith, untouched, waiting. Keanu arrived just before midnight. No cameras, no handlers. Just him, a dark coat, and Yasuo's metronome in his pocket. He didn't play. He just stood there. One of the technicians nodded toward the piano. "Would you like to check it?" Keanu smiled softly. "Not yet. It's not my turn." The tech hesitated. "Belinsky said he's performing." "Oh no. Is that okay?" Keanu looked at the keys, then at his own hands. "It's perfect." Meanwhile, across town, Anton Belinsky was finishing dinner at a five-star restaurant with a circle of patrons and critics. Wine flowed. Laughter crackled. But when one reporter asked if he was nervous about sharing the stage with a Hollywood icon, Anton didn't flinch. "I've shared the stage with prodigies and professors," he said. "Tomorrow, I'll share it with a man who thinks pain alone qualifies as art." There was polite laughter, but Anton's eyes didn't smile, because somewhere in the quiet he never acknowledged, he remembered Yasuo too. Remembered a time when the music was more than competition. A time when emotion mattered more than precision. A time before ego. But the memory was buried, and Anton was too practiced at forgetting. Back at the hall, Keanu stood by the piano and finally lifted the lid. He ran his fingers gently along the edge of the keys, not pressing, just hovering. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't afraid, but he was reverent, not toward the audience, or the silence he was about to interrupt. That night, Naomi sent one final message. Breathe in the silence before the first note. That's where the piece begins. Keanu read it twice. Then he wound the metronome once, listened to its soft rhythm, and walked out into the night. The performance was 12 hours away, but the music had already begun. The day of the gala arrived with fanfare far beyond the music world. Television crews lined the marble steps of the historic hall. Fans with handmade signs clustered behind barricades, hoping for a glimpse. It felt more like a film premiere than a classical concert. Inside, the atmosphere was different. Polished, poised, expectant. Backstage, musicians tuned strings, ran scales, cleared their throats. The air buzzed with adrenaline and judgment. Keanu sat alone in a small green room, eyes closed, not meditating, listening. The metronome ticked softly beside him. He didn't need it anymore, but he wanted its rhythm in the room, as if Yasuo himself were still counting time. A knock. It was the stage manager. "They're almost ready for Belinsky." Keanu nodded. "And you?" "I'll be there." Across the hall, Anton Belinsky stood before the mirror in his dressing room, adjusting his cufflinks with clinical precision. He didn't ask for silence. He didn't warm up. He didn't need to. He was the favorite, the standard, the name that had sold out a dozen festivals. He walked out to the stage with ease, bowing to thunderous applause. His piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, was flawless. Every crescendo perfectly timed, every phrase crisp and alive. The audience roared. It was a triumph. And when Anton left the stage, his eyes flicked toward the curtain, toward Keanu. No words, just a smirk. Then, silence. It was Keanu's turn. He walked out slowly. No tuxedo, no bright lights, just a dark suit, no tie, and Yasuo's metronome in hand. He placed it gently on the piano, wound it once. Tick, 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 then sat. The audience leaned forward. The first notes came like a breath held too long. Hesitant, raw, real. The river's silence unfolded, not with mastery, but with memory. Each measure told a story, of loss, of love, of something that never fully healed. Keanu's hands trembled at times, but they never stopped. He wasn't performing, he was remembering. By the final phrase, the hall was motionless. And when the last note faded, no one clapped, because they couldn't, because their eyes were wet, because silence had returned, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. Even Anton, watching from the shadows, did not move. The stage lights dimmed. Keanu stood, bowed once, and left. No smile, no speech, no need, because he had said everything he needed to say, without a single word. The World Music Peace Gala had never felt like this. There had been famous performers before, heads of state, cultural icons, even royal guests. But tonight, something was different. The air buzzed with curiosity, tension, and the unmistakable energy of waiting for something no one could predict. Every seat in the concert hall was filled. Rows of velvet chairs held some of the most influential names in the world of music, film, philanthropy, and politics. Spotlights swept across the room before fading to gold. On the left side of the audience, a group of Juilliard students clutched their programs tightly, whispering about technique and honor. On the right, seasoned journalists prepared their review drafts in advance, already sure of how the night would go. In the center aisle sat Naomi Tanaka. She wore a simple navy dress. Her father's watch glinted on her wrist. She had flown in from Kyoto that morning, not to coach, but to listen. Backstage, the orchestra fell silent. A voice came over the speakers announcing the program. Applause rose before Anton Belinsky's name was even finished. He entered the stage like he was born on it. Chin high, shoulders perfect, a glint in his eye that caught every camera. He didn't bow too low. He didn't waste time acknowledging anyone in particular. He took his seat like a king claiming a throne. His fingers danced over the keys, precise, powerful, completely in control. The piece was bold, showy. It thundered through the hall like a declaration of war on mediocrity. The audience loved it. He ended with a theatrical flourish and a playful wink, drawing laughter and a standing ovation from half the room. He bowed with grace, then turned and left the stage, the tails of his jacket catching the spotlight. Backstage, he passed Keanu. He gave no nod, no words, just a quick glance, and then he was gone. Keanu stood alone for a moment, then took a breath, picked up Yasuro's metronome, and stepped into the light. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't wave. He walked slowly to the piano, placed the metronome on top, and sat. No one knew what to expect. The hall fell silent. The cameras zoomed in, and Keanu closed his eyes. The room had never been so still. Keanu sat with his hands resting lightly on the keys, as if asking permission. His breathing matched the tick of the metronome. Tick, tick, tick. Then, finally, he began. The first notes of The River's Silence were barely above a whisper. Gentle, hesitant, like footsteps returning to a place long abandoned. The melody did not command attention. It asked for it. Some people in the audience tilted their heads. Others closed their eyes. There were no sweeping gestures, no dramatic flourishes. Just music, carried on a current of memory. In the back row, a film director put down his phone and forgot to pick it up again. Near the aisle, a young girl studying cello for the first time reached for her mother's hand. And in the press box, a critic who had prepared a snide opening line slowly erased it. As the piece unfolded, Keanu's playing grew, not louder, not faster, but deeper. The melody dipped into sadness, then rose into something else. Not hope, not joy. Something quieter, something like understanding. Anton stood in the wings, watching. At first, he looked bored, then confused, then still, because he recognized it. Not just the composition, but the feeling beneath it. Yasuo's fingerprints were everywhere, not in technique, but in the spaces between. The silences that carried more weight than the notes. The tempo that wavered slightly, not from error, but from humanity. Naomi in the audience felt her throat tighten. She remembered her father once saying, "Anyone can learn to play, but few are brave enough to let the music carry their wounds." Keanu didn't try to hide his. His fingers trembled on a single high note near the middle of the piece, and instead of correcting it, he let it live. Let it shake in the air like a fragile truth. A pause. Then the music continued, slower now, more inward. He wasn't performing. He was remembering. Each phrase seemed like a conversation between grief and grace. Between the version of him who once sat beside Yasuo as a young man and the one now, trying to make peace with the silence that followed. No one coughed. No one moved, because they all felt it. This wasn't a Hollywood actor showing off. This was a man telling a story only he could tell, and they were listening. As the final passage of the river's silence approached, Keanu's shoulders dropped, his entire frame softening into the music. The keys beneath his hands weren't just tools, they were memory. Memory of every note Yasuo had whispered, every lesson shared in quiet corners of a dim practice room. The melody narrowed into a single thread, a few slow notes, a lingering pause, then the final phrase. A fragile resolution that didn't tie everything together, but simply accepted what couldn't be fixed. When it ended, the silence was immediate. It wasn't awkward. It was sacred. There was no rush to applaud, no burst of noise, just stillness, reverent, vulnerable. It was Anton who moved first. He didn't clap. He didn't scoff. He simply stepped further into the wings, arms crossed, eyes locked on the man seated at the piano. There was something in his face, part resistance, part recognition. Keanu stood slowly. He bowed once, not to the audience, but to the piano, then turned and walked off stage. The metronome remained ticking behind him. Tick, tick, tick. Only then did the applause begin. Not a roar, but a wave. Soft at first, then building. But it never became wild. It wasn't for fame. It was for something they didn't quite know how to name. In the front row, a seasoned conductor wiped his eyes and whispered to no one in particular, "That wasn't a performance. That was an elegy." Backstage, Keanu paused beside the curtain. He could hear the applause rising and falling like breath. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He just placed his hand gently on the metronome before lifting it off the piano. As he turned to leave, he passed Anton. They didn't speak, but Anton held Keanu's gaze for a long moment. And for the first time in years, Anton's expression was not condescending. It was quiet, even humbled. Keanu gave a small nod and walked into the hall's shadows. Behind him, the river's silence had already begun echoing around the world. Keanu stepped off stage, the applause still echoing behind him like distant thunder. He didn't linger in the hallway or soak in any of the backstage congratulations that began to form around him. A few volunteers and musicians reached out to thank him, to say something, anything. But he simply offered them a nod and moved forward. In his hand, he held the small wooden metronome. It ticked quietly with each step, like a soft heartbeat against his palm. He returned to the green room and sat on the edge of the old wooden bench. For the first time since the performance, he exhaled fully. There had been a moment, just one, during the final stretch of the river's silence, when he almost broke. It was during the crescendo, where the melody briefly swelled, only to collapse into stillness again. That had been Yasuo's signature. He never liked conclusions that tied things too neatly. Life, he'd once said, didn't work like that. Keanu had felt his throat tighten. His wrist had stiffened. The pain in his fingers returned. But he kept going, not perfectly, but truthfully. Now, sitting in the silence, he wasn't sure what had just happened out there. All he knew was that it had come from the deepest place he knew. He opened the top of the metronome and found the engraving again. Time reveals everything. There was a knock on the door. It opened slowly. Anton Belinsky stood in the doorway. No fanfare, no photographers, just the sharp silhouette of the man who had once sneered into a microphone about actors and monologues. Keanu didn't stand. He just looked up. Anton didn't speak right away. Instead, he stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. He moved slowly, not like a man defeated, but like one reconsidering a belief he'd held for too long. Anton finally said, "He taught you that piece." Keanu nodded. Anton sat in the empty chair across from him. "I knew Yasuo once," he said. "We studied together, competed. I thought I knew his music better than anyone. But that piece..." He trailed off. Keanu waited. Anton blinked slowly. "He never taught it to me." Keanu met his eyes. He didn't teach it to many. And yet, Anton continued, voice barely above a whisper, you didn't play it like a student. You played it like someone who knew what it meant. Keanu looked down at his hands, fingers still shaking faintly. I didn't play it to prove anything. Anton nodded. That's why it mattered. Anton's voice shifted. It lost its polish, lost the distance that had kept him apart from others for so long. I used to think mastery was about control, he said. Precision, discipline. I spent my whole life mastering pieces, chasing perfection. Keanu nodded slightly, watching him. Anton tapped his fingers on the edge of the chair, not with arrogance, but with quiet regret. But your performance, it wasn't perfect. Keanu let a soft smile form. It wasn't meant to be. No, Anton said, almost to himself. It was something else. It was lived in. A beat of silence passed between them. Then Anton reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a photograph. It was old, black and white, a little worn at the edges. He held it out. Keanu took it gently. Two young men stood in the photo. One was clearly Anton, barely 20, full of fire. The other was Yasuo, smiling calmly, one hand resting on the edge of a piano. Keanu traced the edges with his thumb. We argued constantly, Anton said. He believed music was a conversation. I believed it was a competition. He was right, of course. I just didn't know how to lose with grace. Keanu looked up, meeting his eyes. He forgave people easily, Anton exhaled. And he taught those who needed it most. He leaned back in his chair. I was never one of those people. You were, Keanu replied softly. You just didn't know when to listen. The words landed without anger, just truth. Anton took a long breath. I do now. Absolutely. There was no apology in his voice, but there was something better. Understanding. Keanu stood slowly, still holding the photo. He walked to the nearby table, set down the metronome, and placed the photo beside it. Hell told me once, Keanu said, that grief is the sound no one hears when the music stops. I didn't understand what he meant until he was gone. Anton nodded, standing as well. He would have been proud of you. Keanu looked back at the stage entrance. I hope he heard it. Anton placed a hand on the doorframe. Oh, he heard it. He turned, paused, and said something Keanu never expected. Thank you for reminding me why I started. Keanu nodded. Thank you for showing up. Anton left without another word. Keanu stood alone in the quiet room, the ticking of the metronome echoing again. Not rushing, not slowing, but steady. Like grief, like memory, like the river. Keanu remained alone for a few minutes more, watching the hands of the metronome rise and fall in silence. The sound of the gala beyond the door was distant now, like the world had receded to give him a moment to breathe. He packed the metronome carefully into his bag, along with the photo of Yasuo and Anton. These weren't trophies. They were reminders of the music, the people, the pain, and the quiet places that still held meaning. When he stepped back into the hallway, he didn't expect applause. There was none. Just a quiet nod from a young woman working coat check. She didn't ask for a picture, didn't say a word, but her eyes were red. Outside, the city lights cast long shadows across the pavement. The marquee still flashed the name of the gala in gold. Paparazzi waited near the main exit, but Keanu took the side stairs, slipping past the bustle, past the noise. He walked 3 blocks before hailing a cab. When the driver asked where to, Keanu gave the name of a quiet piano bar he'd once visited with Yasuo, tucked in a forgotten alleyway off the East River. The cab pulled away from the curb. In the back seat, Keanu took out the worn sheet music. Not to study, just to hold. The composition had changed him. But more than that, It had revealed something still alive inside him. The piece wasn't about loss. It was about the silence that comes after, and what you choose to do with it. The cab rolled on through midnight traffic. Across the city, in homes and studios and dorm rooms, people were replaying his performance already. Not for technique, but for feeling. It didn't trend immediately. It didn't need to. The ones who needed it found it. Somewhere in Berlin, a widowed violinist cried watching the live stream. In Tokyo, a retired piano teacher whispered Yasuo's name into her teacup. In a community center in Queens, a teenage boy who had never touched a piano before decided to try. And in Kyoto, Naomi sat alone at her father's upright piano. She placed the metronome at the edge of the keys. Tick, tick. Then she began to play, not the river silence, but a new piece, one filled with gratitude and continuation. Back in New York, Keanu stepped out of the cab, tipped the driver generously, and walked into the dim piano bar unnoticed. He didn't ask for the spotlight. He just sat at the old upright in the corner, placed the metronome on top, and began again. The sound of the gala's final announcements echoed faintly through the back corridors of the concert hall. The applause had long since died down, replaced by the clinking of glasses and soft conversations that followed an evening no one had expected to end this way. Keanu sat alone in a quiet backstage lounge, still dressed in the simple black he'd worn for the performance. His jacket hung loosely on the back of a chair, and the small wooden metronome rested on the table before him, ticking softly as if time itself had slowed to honor what had just passed. The room was dim, lit only by a side lamp casting golden light across the walls. There were no cameras, no staff, just him, the metronome, and a silence that felt earned. Then the door creaked open. Anton Belinsky entered. No entourage, no arrogance, just Anton. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The two men, once opposites in almost every sense, now stood within the same understanding, and for a few moments neither moved. Then Anton stepped forward and looked down at the metronome. His eyes lingered on the inscription. "Time reveals everything," he read aloud. Keanu gave a small nod. He believed that. Anton smiled faintly. "He did. Yasuo always had patience. I never did." He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a worn, folded photograph. Without a word, he handed it to Keanu. Keanu opened it carefully. Two young men, Yasuo and Anton, smiling in black and white, their hair slicked back, jackets pressed, standing arm in arm outside a Tokyo Music Academy. Keanu held it gently, like something sacred. "I didn't know," Keanu said softly, "that you knew each other." Anton looked toward the floor, then back up. "We were boys together, competed in everything. Piano, theory, girls. He won most of the time." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "But not always?" Anton laughed once, a real laugh, stripped of ego. "No, not always. But when he lost, he made it feel like you'd won something more." He walked around the small table and took the seat across from Keanu, his posture calm, his tone even. "Sometimes I get so touched and cleaved, I can't understand which two." Anton said, "What's that?" Keanu asked. "That music isn't about impressing others. It's about remembering who you are." Keanu looked down at the photo again, his thumb tracing the edge of Yasuo's image. "Why didn't you stay in touch?" he asked. Anton leaned back in the chair, folding his arms. Not defensively, but as someone preparing to tell the truth. "I let pride get in the way," he said quietly. "After we graduated, I wanted to be the first among us to play Berlin, to headline Paris. Yasuo, he stayed in Japan. He took a post at a rural conservatory, taught children who couldn't pay him." He shook his head, almost smiling. "I used to call it wasting talent." "And now?" Keanu asked. Anton's voice dropped. "Now, I think he was saving lives." The ticking of the metronome continued softly between them. I used to think, Anton continued, that playing with emotion made you weak, that perfection was the only language worth speaking. Keanu nodded slowly. I believed that once, too. Anton looked directly at him. But tonight, you didn't play a piece. You played a memory, a life, a loss. Keanu's throat tightened. I didn't know if I could, he admitted. When I touched the first keys, it felt like I was back in Yasuo's old studio. He used to say, "The piano is honest. It won't lie for you, so don't lie to it." Anton smiled. He said the same to me, right after I butchered a Chopin nocturne. Both men laughed softly. The laughter faded, replaced by something deeper. Stillness, respect, and the quiet bond of men who had both loved the same teacher in different ways. Anton reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small envelope. This was the last thing he sent me. I never opened it, he said. I was too proud. I figured it was just more of his poetic nonsense. But after tonight, I think it's time. Keanu hesitated. Do you want to open it now? Anton looked at the envelope, then handed it to Keanu. You should. You honored him more than I ever did. Keanu carefully broke the seal and slid out a single sheet of rice paper, written in elegant brushstrokes. Yasuo's handwriting. He read aloud. To Anton. When you learn to play from silence, not ambition, I'll be listening. Anton closed his eyes. I think he was, he said softly. I think he was listening through you. Keanu folded the letter gently and placed it beside the photo on the table. For a moment, neither man said anything. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was reverent, the kind that follows truth laid bare. Never forgot either of us, Keanu said quietly. Anton nodded. No, and maybe we were both too slow to realize what he gave. Keanu leaned forward slightly. He gave us more than music. Anton looked at him, eyes softer than they'd been in years of public appearances. He gave us a standard, not of excellence, but of integrity. The metronome ticked once more. Anton stood and moved toward the door, but before stepping out, he turned back. You've changed people tonight, he said, not with the notes, but with the way you played them. Keanu looked up, surprised. You too, he said. In the end, you showed up. Anton smiled. Yasuo would have liked that. He left without another word, closing the door behind him with the softest click. Keanu sat still. The metronome tapped out the seconds. He gathered the photograph, the letter, and the metronome, and placed them in his bag with care. Then he stood, walked slowly back to the empty stage, and looked out at the now vacant seats. The piano remained under the lights, waiting. He didn't sit down. He simply bowed his head and whispered, "Thank you," not to the crowd, not to Anton, to the man who once told him music was not for fame or perfection but for healing. And in that moment, Keanu finally understood. You don't always need applause to know you've been heard. You just need one person. And Yasuo Tanaka had been listening all along. The morning after the World Music Peace Gala, the world began to stir. It didn't happen with screaming headlines or pre-planned interviews. There was no scheduled segment on late-night shows, no viral social media challenge. It began quietly, almost like the performance itself. A few blurry clips, posted by audience members who hadn't known what to expect when Keanu Reeves sat down at that piano. One video, just 2 minutes long, showed nothing but Keanu's back as he began the first trembling notes of the river silence. The caption read, "I've never seen a room so quiet, or so full." Within hours, it had 800,000 views. By midday, it was 3 million. There were no fancy camera angles, no cutaway shots to teary-eyed celebrities. Just a man, seated alone at a piano, playing something ancient and fragile and deeply human. The press didn't know what to make of it. The New York Times ran the headline, "Keanu Reeves plays a song the world forgot." A Washington Post columnist wrote, "It was less of a performance and more of a remembrance, like someone had opened a window into grief and let it breathe." Classical musicians took to online forums. Some criticized his technique. Others admitted grudgingly that the imperfections were what made it unforgettable. One pianist from Prague wrote, "There were missed notes, uneven tempo, but God help me, I cried anyway." The conversation quickly moved beyond the music itself. People began sharing their own stories, of teachers they lost, of moments that passed, of letters they never wrote. The hashtag, "The River's Silence," began trending in over a dozen countries. No one knew where the piece came from. No published recording existed. Music historians scrambled to trace it, finally linking the composition to Yasuo Tanaka, a name that, until now, lived in the margins of academia and forgotten student recordings. Then someone unearthed an old recital program from 1986, listing The River's Silence as a closing piece in a Kyoto University showcase. Beside the title, "Not for Publication," the mystery only deepened the meaning. And through it all, Keanu said nothing. His name was everywhere, his face in every video frame. But there were no statements, no press appearances. He didn't even repost the performance. He simply vanished. And that silence, too, spoke volumes. While talk shows speculated and fan accounts dissected each phrase of the melody, Keanu kept moving. No Instagram posts, no red carpet follow-up. He was already back on a film set in Iceland, bundled in a black coat, head down, focused. When a reporter tried to approach him outside a hotel, asking, "What made you choose that piece?" Keanu simply smiled, tipped his head gently, and walked past, without a word. That moment, too, went viral, because it reinforced what people were beginning to understand. He hadn't played that night to prove anything. He had played to remember. And perhaps more importantly, he had played to let others remember too. Musicians across the world began posting their own interpretations of the river's silence. Each was different, some on piano, others on cello, even acoustic guitar. But no one quite captured the original tone, because the original wasn't just music. It was lived through emotion. A high school teacher in Missouri played it for her trauma therapy class. A hospice center in Denmark requested it during end-of-life care. A wounded veteran in Maine shared, "I watched it 100 times. I don't even like piano, but this helped." And quietly, in the background, Naomi Tanaka received hundreds of emails. Some from old students, some from strangers, some simply saying, "I heard your father's voice last night." She replied to every one, with a thank you, some with scanned sheet music, some with nothing but a single sentence, "You're not alone." Back in Tokyo, a small community music school hung a new framed photograph in their front lobby. It showed Yasuo Tanaka standing beside a teenage Keanu Reeves in a cluttered practice room, both smiling, both unaware of what that moment would someday mean. Below the photo, a brass plaque read, "Those who listen with their hearts will always be heard." Still, Keanu gave no statement. A major magazine reached out for a cover story. They offered to fly him anywhere, to pair the shoot with a donation drive. He declined, politely but firmly, because for Keanu, the point wasn't to be seen. It was to remind others what silence could hold. And in a world overflowing with noise, that choice felt revolutionary. As the days passed, articles gave way to essays. Music forums became journals of grief and gratitude. But still, no official upload of Keanu's performance appeared. The shaky clips posted by audience members remained the only available versions, and Keanu's team made no move to erase or polish them. That rawness, its unfiltered honesty, became part of the legacy. In conservatories across Europe and Asia, Music theory professors introduced the river's silence as a study in restraint and emotional pacing. "It's not written in ink," one professor in Amsterdam said. "It's written in memory." Meanwhile, Naomi Tanaka received a package. No return address, but she knew who it was from. Inside, a copy of the original recital program from 1986, now laminated, with Yasuo's handwritten annotation under the title, "Something No One Had Noticed Until Now. Pay only when you have something to forgive." Naomi wept. Not because the world had finally heard her father's music, but because someone had understood it. Back in Los Angeles, Keanu sat at the same upright piano he'd practiced on before. No cameras, no applause. Just him, his hands, and the old metronome, now ticking gently beside a tea mug. He opened Yasuo's notebook one last time. Read the familiar scrawled sentence. "Ande, you will return to the notes, not to impress, but to speak what words cannot." He closed the notebook and sat in the stillness. In the distance, his phone buzzed. His assistant had sent a message. A foundation was forming, requests for funding. Dozens of schools wanted access to musical therapy materials inspired by the river's silence. They wanted to name a program after it. Wanted permission. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He let the metronome run out. Then he rose, stretched, and walked to the window. It wasn't his music. It never had been. It belonged to everyone who needed it. Everyone who had ever sat with grief too large for words. And in that silence, filled not with fame, but with meaning, Keanu smiled. Not the smile of someone who had succeeded, but of someone who had made peace with an unfinished song. Let the world sing now, he thought. His part was done. The letter arrived 2 weeks after the performance. It wasn't sent through an assistant or a courier. It wasn't emailed or typed. It was handwritten, in clean, deliberate brushstrokes on textured Japanese washi paper, folded inside a soft white envelope. Keanu recognized the sender by the return address, Naomi Tanaka. He waited before opening it. Let it sit on his piano for 3 days. He wasn't sure why. Maybe part of him feared what it might say. Or maybe he just wanted to open it at the right time, when the air was still, and the room quiet enough to hear whatever Yasuo's daughter had to share. That moment came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. He sat at the piano, placed the envelope on the bench beside him, and opened it with a breath held in the heart. The letter read, "Dear Keanu, I wasn't going to write. I thought silence was better, but then I remembered what silence meant to my father. He used to say, 'Silence is only noble when it has served its purpose.' You gave purpose to his silence. You gave his notes breath again. You didn't just play a piece, you played his soul back into the world. And for that, I thank you." Keanu paused. His eyes traced the lines again, taking in each word. The letter continued, "There is something you should know. My father kept journals, dozens of them. Most are about technique, teaching methods, critiques of famous performances. But one is different. It's shorter, almost like a diary. In it, he only mentioned 3 students by name. One was Anton, one was me, and one was you," he wrote. Keanu plays like someone trying to remember someone they lost. That is the beginning of real music. I think he always knew your path would lead back to the piano. The next paragraph was written more carefully, as if Naomi had taken longer to decide on the phrasing. "I would like to invite you to Kyoto. Not for a concert, not for the public, just to sit at my father's original piano. It still stands in his old studio, untouched since he passed. You don't have to play. You don't have to speak. There's nothing left to prove, only to field." At the bottom, she signed with the same steady handwriting. "With quiet gratitude, Naomi Tanaka." Keanu folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the envelope. He stared out the window as the rain tapped gently on the glass, and quietly he whispered, "Yeah." Keanu's assistant booked the trip without questions. One-way ticket. No press, no hotel suite. Just a quiet ryokan on the outskirts of Kyoto, surrounded by maples and fog. When he arrived, the air felt different, softer, like the whole city breathed slower than the one he left behind. Naomi met him at the train station herself, holding a small sign with his name. Not for show, just tradition. They didn't speak much during the ride. He didn't expect her to look so much like her father. Same eyes, same upright posture, same pause before speaking. She led him through narrow alleys to a small two-story building with ivy creeping up one side and wind chimes singing near the eaves. This was his studio, she said simply. The inside smelled of old wood and paper. Sunlight streamed through rice paper windows, casting soft shadows on the tatami floors. There were bookshelves filled with sheet music, a framed photo of Yasuo beside a young Naomi, and at the center, his piano. It wasn't glamorous, not concert grade, but it was loved. Its wood slightly faded, a small chip near the left pedal, a silk cloth draped over the top, hand-embroidered with Japanese calligraphy. Naomi removed the cloth, folded it carefully, and stepped back. "Hell never let anyone move it," she said. "Even when we moved houses." He said it wasn't a piano, it was a conversation that never ended. Keanu approached slowly. His fingers brushed the keys, not to play, just to feel the familiar smoothness. He sat. No cameras, no stage, no one watching. Just him, Naomi standing near the window, and the instrument that had waited longer than he'd realized. He didn't play the river's silence. That had already been spoken. Instead, he closed his eyes and let his hands settle, and out came the soft tones of an old melody, one Yasuo had taught him as a warm-up. Simple, slow, built more for breath than technique. Naomi closed her eyes too. She didn't speak, didn't correct, just listened. When he stopped, the silence held. It wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Like the room remembered something with him. "You still play like someone remembering," she said. Keanu looked up. "But this time," she added, "it sounds like forgiveness." That evening, they shared tea in the back garden, sitting on cushions beneath a gently swaying plum tree. The conversation drifted from Yasuo's favorite composers to his obsession with silence. Naomi laughed as she recalled how her father once made an entire class sit in stillness for 15 minutes just to understand timing. Earnshaw said silence is a sound. Most people just don't know how to hear it. Keanu nodded slowly. "He taught me to listen to the pauses, not just the notes." "I didn't get it then." "You got it now," she said. "That's why I invited you." The sky dimmed into indigo. Paper lanterns flickered on the porch rail. Naomi handed him a small, lacquered box wrapped in blue silk. "Harris asked me to give this to you someday," she said, "if you ever returned." Keanu unwrapped it with care. Inside was a single sheet of hand-inked music paper, not a full composition, just the opening bars of something unfinished. The notation was unmistakably Yasuo's. At the bottom, one line, written in delicate brushstroke. "For the student who taught me grief is not the end of music, but its beginning." Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. The page shook slightly in his hands, not from fear or doubt, but from recognition. A circle closed, not with fanfare, but with meaning. Naomi poured more tea. "I've been asked to teach in London," she said. "They want to open a small international branch, partly funded by donations after your performance." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say yes yet," she continued, "but I'll go, as long as they understand the program won't be about perfection. It will be about story." He smiled, the same soft, tired smile he wore when speaking about the things that mattered most. They didn't talk about concerts or careers. They talked about the students who'd need this next, the kids who would never be prodigies, but who might find their voice in a single broken chord. Before he left, Naomi walked him back to the piano one more time. "I think he would have been proud of you," she said. Keanu looked at the bench. "Not because you played well," she added, "but because you played honestly." And with that he bowed, not to her, but to the instrument, to the room, to the memory that had waited so long to be heard again. When the door closed behind him, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was whole. 3 months had passed since Keanu stood in Yasuo Tanaka's studio in Kyoto, but the silence of that piano bench stayed with him. It echoed louder than applause ever could. Back in Los Angeles, he paced his office with a pen in one hand and a notebook in the other. The page was filled with scratched-out names. Keanu Reeves Foundation for Music, the Yasuo Tanaka Initiative, even notes beyond the screen. None of them sat right. They felt like headlines, not heartbeats. He paused, remembered the river, the first note of the piece, the way it didn't rush forward, but unfolded like grief, like breath. He wrote slowly, intentionally, "The river's silence," and then, underneath, one more line, "Let this help those who've lived between the notes." He circled both, then underlined the name twice. That same week, without press, he instructed his team to begin the endowment process. $2,500,000, 0 cents, initially anonymous. A fund for students at Juilliard, not just any students, but those with a story like his. Kids who had lost someone, who had stopped playing and started again, who played not for perfection, but for peace. Keanu worked with Naomi Tanaka to build the framework. She had recently accepted a guest residency in New York, and when Keanu asked her to help shape the first year's curriculum, she replied with only 4 words, "For my father's students." Together, they designed an application that broke every rule. There were no auditions, no resumes, no GPA cutoffs. Instead, the students would submit a letter, a real one, handwritten if possible, explaining why they played, what silence meant to them, and how they had used music not to escape something, but to sit with it. They could submit any piece. It didn't need to be original, it just needed to be honest. One applicant sent a recording of them playing on a broken keyboard in a shelter basement. Another sent a voicemail of her humming a melody to her child. A boy from Milwaukee uploaded a video of him playing piano while his dog howled in the background. Juilliard was skeptical until the first committee meeting. One board member was seen wiping her eyes halfway through the first letter. And at the bottom of every submission was a required line. "Tell us what silence has taught you." Keanu would never see most of their faces, but he read every letter. And with each one, he remembered something Yasuo once told him. Technique impresses the ear, truth moves the soul. Naomi arrived in New York the week the first scholarship recipients were announced. She didn't walk in as a celebrity guest. No media, no fanfare. She came with a single notebook, a quiet voice, and a mission. Her first seminar at Juilliard was standing room only. Not because of her name, but because of the program's mystery. Everyone had heard of the river's silence, but no one quite knew who had funded it, only that it had changed everything about what the school looked for. Naomi opened the session with a quote from her father, written in soft white chalk across the blackboard. "Silence is not what's left when music ends. It's where the truth begins." She didn't teach scales or posture that day. Instead, she asked each student one question. "What was the first sound you remember crying to?" They hesitated, then, one by one, began to answer. One said the whistle of a train pulling away the day her father left. Another said a funeral hymn. One boy whispered, My mother's voice saying goodbye. And then they played. It wasn't flawless, but it was real. Naomi called Keanu that night. Her voice was thick with emotion. "They're not just playing the piece," she said. "They're playing the story underneath it." Keanu smiled, listening in silence on the other end. He didn't need to say much. This had never been about building a monument. It was about creating a room where vulnerability was the qualification, not the obstacle. Within weeks, whispers of the program spread across the arts world. Other schools reached out to Juilliard for the application format. Foundations inquired how they could support more students like the ones Naomi was training. Several teachers requested guest access to observe the sessions. A prestigious conservatory in Berlin asked Naomi if she'd consider a similar class there. But she declined. "It belongs here," she said, "where it began." Juilliard itself issued a quiet press release acknowledging the anonymous donor and welcoming Naomi Tanaka as the first official guest lecturer in the program's history. They didn't name Keanu. He never asked them to. Instead, he sat in the back row of one of Naomi's open recitals, hood up, silent, unnoticed. He watched as a teenage girl played a lullaby with trembling fingers. Her piece ended on a single held note, barely audible. The room didn't clap. They exhaled, and Keanu whispered under his breath, "That's it." A month later, Naomi found a small package waiting on her desk at Juilliard. No return address, just her name, written in Keanu's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a single cassette tape. On the label, 2 words in jet. "Tadaima, I'm home." She borrowed an old Declises from the archives and slid the tape in. For a moment, there was only a soft hiss, then the sound of a piano. Familiar, aching, imperfect. Keanu had recorded the river's silence in one take, no edits, no mastering. At the very end, his voice came through, barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Yasuo, for everything I couldn't say." Naomi closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she wept. Meanwhile, across campus, the newly dedicated practice wing was opened to the first cohort of scholarship students. Carved into the entrance stone, beneath the Juilliard crest, was a single phrase, "The river's silence, where truth begins." Inside, one room remained untouched. It was furnished with an old upright piano, donated anonymously. In the corner, behind a glass case, sat a worn metronome with an engraving. Time reveals everything. That room quickly became a sanctuary. Students went there not to practice, but to feel, to remember, to breathe. Some brought letters, others brought flowers. One left a single sheet of paper with the words, "This is the first time I've felt seen." The legacy Keanu built wasn't in a name. It was in every moment someone sat alone at a piano and let go of their fear. Every second they chose vulnerability over perfection. Every student who whispered, "Maybe I can after all." Years later, a Juilliard professor would describe the program this way in a journal. "The river's silence didn't just change how we teach, it reminded us why we play." As for Keanu, he never took credit, never gave a speech, never once mentioned the gala, or Anton, or the feud that had lit the match. He just kept playing, quietly, in private, wherever a piano was near. And sometimes, when no one was watching, he would open the old music notebook Yasuo had given him and trace the faded lines of the handwritten score. The final page always made him pause. Beneath the last note, Yasuo had scribbled a message. The most honest notes are the ones we're afraid to play. And Keanu would smile, close the book, and whisper, "Still learning." The envelope was thick, the kind that didn't belong in a digital world. Keanu found it on his doorstep, left without fanfare or messenger. Handwritten in soft Japanese calligraphy, his name flowed across the paper like music itself. No return address, just a Kyoto stamp pressed gently into the corner. He didn't open it right away. He stood there holding it for a long time, staring at the way the ink curved. Then he walked inside and set it on the piano, beside the metronome that had become his silent companion over the past few months. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow on the surface of the keys. Finally, he opened it. Inside was a single, folded invitation card. Simple parchment, no embossing, no logos, just black ink, centered on the page. You are invited to a private concert. One piece, one player, one story continued. Location: Yasuo Tanaka's studio, Kyoto. Date: April 12. Time: 8 p.m. And below, a signature in elegant script. Naomi Tanaka. No explanation, no introduction, no RS. Keanu didn't need one. He set the invitation beside the folded cloth that had once protected Yasuo's metronome. His eyes lingered on the inscription carved into its base. Time reveals everything. He touched the wood like it was skin. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. No press releases, no foundation announcements, no interviews. He packed a single black duffel bag, placed a small, worn notebook inside, and quietly booked a flight to Kyoto, under a name only his closest friends knew. He wore his favorite denim jacket, the one with the frayed cuff, and brought no assistants, no entourage, no makeup team or schedule handler, just himself, and a decision. When he landed in Japan, the air felt different, quieter, more whole. The car Naomi had arranged didn't carry his name. The driver simply bowed and opened the door without a word. They drove through the narrow streets of Kyoto, past lantern-lit alleys and aging wood-framed homes, until they arrived at a small studio with a sliding door and ivy along the rooftop. Keanu stepped out, looked up at the building. The air smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Naomi waited at the door. She didn't say hello. She didn't bow at first. She simply looked at him, then smiled. "You came," she said softly. Keanu nodded. "I came back." She slid the door open and motioned him inside. Everything in the room was just as he remembered, and exactly what he had forgotten. The room was smaller than Keanu remembered, or maybe his memories had grown too large with time. Wooden floorboards creaked beneath his boots. Light filtered in through a narrow paper window, casting soft shadows across the old upright piano against the far wall. The same one Yasuo had used to teach him when he was just beginning to grieve and trying to find meaning in melody. Naomi gestured for him to sit. He didn't speak. He walked over, pulled out the bench, and sat down. The piano surface bore tiny scratches from decades of use. The keys were slightly yellowed, uneven in pressure. But it was honest. Not like the digital ones on Hollywood sets or the grand showpieces at galas. This one had history in its wood and forgiveness in its tone. Naomi didn't sit beside him. She stayed near the wall, folding her hands. "You don't have to play," she said. "This isn't a performance." Keanu nodded slowly. "I know." But he placed his fingers on the keys anyway, and started. No warm-up, no metronome, just breath, just memory. He began with a phrase from the river's silence, the same piece that had carried him through grief, that had silenced a room full of critics, that had reopened conversations about healing in ways no dialogue ever could. But here, in this studio, it felt different, less like a revelation, more like a return. Each note was softer than the last, and yet fuller. Keanu's body leaned into the keys, not as a player trying to control a song, but as a man asking it to carry him. The room didn't echo with applause. It breathed with him. When he reached the final note, he let it linger. Then he closed the lid. Naomi walked over and placed something on the bench beside him. It was a photo, old and curled at the edges. It showed Yasuo sitting at that very piano, a small boy standing beside him with messy hair and a serious expression. Keanu recognized himself instantly. Maybe 6 years old? Maybe 7. That was the first lesson. He hadn't even remembered a picture had been taken. "I found it in one of Father's old notebooks," Naomi said quietly. "He kept it all these years." "You were his last student, but he used to say, 'Sometimes the last student carries the lesson farthest.'" Keanu stared at the photo for a long time, not speaking, not blinking, just remembering. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket over his heart. "I wasn't ready to carry it back then," he said softly, "but maybe I am now." That evening, Naomi prepared a quiet meal: miso soup, grilled vegetables, and tea steeped in silence. They ate without much conversation. It wasn't necessary. The language between them had already been spoken at the piano. After dinner, they stepped outside into the garden behind the studio. A narrow stone path wound between moss-covered rocks and a koi pond that reflected the stars. Bamboo rustled in the wind like soft applause. Keanu stood still, letting the night wrap around him. "Why did he never record it?" he asked after a long while, his voice nearly a whisper. Naomi smiled faintly. "Because it wasn't meant to be recorded. Father believed some music exists only for those who truly need it. The river's silence wasn't composed for concert halls. It was composed for the spaces between grief and peace, for the quiet." Keanu nodded. The quiet had become his companion. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was his handwritten transcription of the river's silence, one he had rewritten after every practice, each version reflecting a new layer of understanding. "I want you to have this," he said, offering it to her. Naomi hesitated. "But this is yours." "It was never mine," he replied. "It was your father's. And now it's the world's. But the first copy belongs here." She accepted it with both hands, bowing slightly. They stood for a while longer under the starlight, until Naomi turned and gestured to the side of the house. "There's one more thing he left for you." She led Keanu to a small storage room beside the studio. Inside was a stack of old boxes, and on top of them a wooden case, long, narrow, and engraved. Keanu opened it gently. Inside was Yasuo's tuning kit, worn tools wrapped in silk cloth, each labeled in hand-painted kanji. A note tucked beneath them read, "To the student who listened between the notes." Keanu smiled. He didn't take the tools with him. He closed the case and left it where it was. "Some things are meant to stay home," he said quietly. The next morning, before leaving Kyoto, Keanu wrote a short entry in the guest book Naomi kept by the piano. Just one line: "Gratitude is the sound no one hears, but the one that echoes longest." He left without saying goodbye, not out of rudeness, but because music, like memory, doesn't always end with a closing line. Sometimes it just fades softly, like the final note of a song, still ringing in your chest, long after it's played. Keanu sat on the edge of his hotel bed, a leather-bound journal open on his lap. A simple black pen rested between his fingers. No cameras, no entourage. Just the quiet hum of city life beyond the glass window, and the sound of a man trying to put something wordless into words. He didn't rush. He rarely did. He stared at the blank page until it stopped being empty. Then, slowly, he began to write. There are moments when silence says more than a speech, when a single note carries a lifetime. He paused, then added another line beneath it. "I didn't return to the piano to prove anything. I returned to remember." There was something sacred about reflection when no one was watching. A kind of honesty that didn't need to impress or explain, just to exist. He thought of Yasuo, of Naomi, of the way his fingers trembled before that first note, of the tears in the room that night, and of the single photo Anton had handed him, a black and white memory that needed no caption. He hadn't said much to anyone about it, and he wouldn't, because not everything sacred needed an audience. The music had spoken, but now, maybe, it was time to ask a question in return. He picked up the pen again. Have you ever tried to speak through something other than words? He wrote it plainly, without decoration, because he wasn't asking as a celebrity. He was asking as someone who knew what it felt like to be full of something too large for language. Grief, memory, love, regret, all the invisible weights people carried and often didn't know where to place. He flipped to the next page and continued. Have you ever honored someone without saying their name? Yasuo had never asked for recognition. He hadn't needed applause or praise. He'd left behind no recordings, no best-selling books, no grand resume. But he'd left behind something better. A student who still heard his voice in every pause between notes. And now that voice was rippling outward through Naomi, through the scholarship, through everyone who saw the performance and felt something stir inside them that they didn't know had gone quiet. Keanu closed the journal, placed it gently in his bag, and stood. There would be more projects, more scripts, more countries to visit, stages to stand on, roles to inhabit. But this one, this moment, would stay untouched. It wasn't just about redemption or reputation. It was about truth, and how sometimes the smallest act of truth, one performance, one page of music, one moment of humility, could reach farther than fame ever could. He stepped out into the hallway and walked slowly, deliberately, as if he were still moving to the rhythm of Yasuo's composition. At the elevator, he turned toward the window one last time and whispered to himself. Some stories don't end, they echo. Underscore, 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 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 5, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, underscore, 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 underscore. And now it's your turn. Have you ever tried to express something through more than just words? A painting, a song, a letter never sent. Have you ever held someone in your heart by doing something they once loved? Even quietly, especially quietly. Sometimes, that's how legacy begins. Not with noise, but with a note that lingers. Share your story in the comments. Have you ever honored someone in silence? Let us know below. What story should Keanu tell next? Subscribe and join the journey. Because the world doesn't need more voices shouting. It needs more hearts listening. And more people like you.